It's time now for Movie Spotlight, where we review some of the latest releases at the Korean box office and online. And we have with us once again our leading pair of film critics, Jason Bechervaise and Darcy Paquet. Gentlemen, it's good to see you both.
Yeah, great to see you.
Hello, Zhang.
Yes, I think any other week we would have started with the Tom Cruise blockbuster that has already made over $1 billion around the world, but we aren't, because this week marked the release of Park Chan-wook's new film Decision to Leave as well, or Hae-il 결심 in Korean. It is, of course, the one that premiered at the Cannes Film Festival in May and took home the Best Director award. Since then, we have been eagerly awaiting this for its release. Darcy, before we talk about the film itself, can you tell us about how this fits into the director's overall career? Because this film, it is somewhat of a departure for the director, right?
Yeah, it does feel a little bit different from his previous films. I mean, Park Chan-wook broke through in 2000 with his third film, JSA. And I mean, ever since then, he's kind of been slotted into this category of extreme cinema or Asian extreme. And, it's partly because, his films are kind of disorienting and he always kind of challenges the audience and throws things at them that they're not expecting. But the subject matter, too, is very kind of strong. So in all of his films, there's some, violence or some other content that tends to shock people and make people uncomfortable. So his biggest international hits up until this point have been Old Boy from 2003 and The Handmaiden from 2016. This new one, it's just as complex, it's just as unexpected and, in its execution, but, it's sort of PG in terms of its content. Like there's nothing in here that's really going to shock an audience.
Sure.
Confuse them possibly, but not to shock them. Sure. And he's even calling it a love story, which, I'm not sure if I agree with that or not. I'm not sure if it's good to go in expecting a love story, but he says it's a love story. Sure.
So it does not have some of the more extreme elements that perhaps the director is usually best known for. Jason, let's talk about the film now. Can you tell us what it's actually about?
Yeah. It's an interesting film for sure. It centers around two characters, essentially. Including police detective played by Paquet. He's based in Busan. He works very hard. He suffers from chronic insomnia, and he commutes back home to his wife on the weekends. He's a little bit different compared to other police detectives we've seen in Korean films. He's intellectual. He's really sophisticated. And his wife is in particular is very affluent. So it's an interesting character for sure, even for Park Chan-wook. Anyway, one day he's assigned a case about a man who fell from the top of a mountain to his death. It looks a bit suspicious, and he ends up interviewing the man's widow, a Chinese woman played by Tang Wei. She first seems to have no connection to the death, but he starts to question her innocence. And over the course of the narrative, we see him falling in love with her, and that's all you really need to know.
Okay, so Darcy, the idea of a police detective falling in love with a suspect seems quite familiar. In fact, we should probably say that it's a bit of a cliche. So filmgoers might be worried about seeing something that is so well-worn. Does Park manage to avoid falling into some of those cliche traps? Is he doing something different?
Yeah, I think the funny thing about cliches is that it ultimately comes down to the details. And, if the details are lazy and boring, then the film feels just too familiar. And in this film, the details are so overwhelming. Like, it's sort of what defines the film in some ways, that, every scene has all these interesting little elements to it. And there are these mini dramas that are playing out. And if you're just sitting and you have to be observant as you're watching this because there's so much going on. And, a lot of it is just kind of small gestures and, things related to everything, from the detective's insomnia or, all these little things that aren't really crucial to the whole plot. And it's true that, the whole plot does feel familiar in that sense, but the film itself never feels familiar because there's never been a movie quite like this, I think.
Okay, never been a movie quite like this. You said it's overwhelming. Does it still mean it's a fun watch? Is it enjoyable?
It is. I mean, I really like this film. It is a challenging film to get your head around. It was really interesting reading the reviews at Cannes because the critics loved it, but then you could feel that they were struggling to write about it. And, particularly at Cannes, where you see the film and you have like 3 or 4 hours to crank out a review. And a lot of them just started, they were so enthusiastic, they started writing about all these interesting details that they saw in the film, and then it filled up the whole review, but it didn't really tell you about kind of the soul of the film or what was going on with it. But it's a film that you should see a couple times. I know that that's an annoying thing for a critic to say, but it's especially true with this one.
Jason, what about for you? There's always a high expectation whenever a Park Chan-wook film comes out, but with the success at Cannes, there's perhaps even a higher expectation this time. Did it meet those expectations?
You know what, exceeded them.
Wow.
It's a fantastic film. It's a masterpiece. It may even be his best film. What's interesting about the film industry here is that these directors are, they're close, they learn from each other, but at the same time, I think there's this like competition amongst them. And it's like with Nangjin's The Wailing, he kind of raised the bar, and then Yi Chang-dong did the same thing with Burning, and then Park Chan-wook did the same thing with Parasite, and then Bong Joon-ho did the same thing with Parasite, and then Park Chan-wook came here and he's produced something very, very special. I mean, it's very kind of Hitchcock-esque in a sense that I think Vertigo especially, and Park Chan-wook's talked about how Vertigo has been a big inspiration on him. Certainly the 2 main characters and just the whole kind of mysteriousness of the film and the mood of it as well. But at the same time, as Bong Joon-ho does in his films, not least Mother, which is also is very kind of Hitchcockian. He very much makes it his own film, and I'm still getting my head around it, but I just thought it was brilliant. I mean, the screenwriting's incredible, and the performances are just jaw-droppingly good. Tang Wei is just absolutely fantastic, and to have a Chinese character in a Korean film, I think it marks. We've seen Chinese characters in Korean films before, but I think Park Chan-wook does something quite profound here, and I loved it. And there's also moments of humour in there, and there's some great cameos, which seems to be quite a thing in the Korean film industry at the moment. And yes, it's a superb film.
Well, Darcy, Jason says brilliant masterpiece. Would you put it on that level? And what do you make of its chances at the Oscars as well? Could it be heading to Hollywood?
I would put it on that level. I think that it's hard to really find any kind of crack in this film. It fits together all so well, and it's really beautifully shot as well. I do kind of take some issue with it being described as a love story because I think love happens in the film, but it's not like there's a distance as you're watching it, and there's always something a little bit cold about Park Chan-wook's style, and that's true of this film as well. And yet it's so incredibly beautifully shot, and the ending really takes your breath away as well.
Oh, yeah. I was like, I'm going there. I don't want to say where it is, but I was just like. I was looking at the credits. It's like, where has this been shot? I want to go there right now. It's so beautiful. Yeah,
and then for the Oscars, I do think it may get some attention. We've had last year it was Drive My Car.
Sure.
A couple of years ago it was Parasite. These international films do have the potential to break through during Oscar season now, and this might be the film this year.
So it sounds like the hype is real, and that listeners should definitely check it out when they can. Okay, let's move on to our second film, and it is the worldwide box office phenomenon Top Gun Maverick, starring Tom Cruise. This is, of course, the follow-up to director Tony Scott's original Top Gun, which came out 36 years ago now, in 1986. As I mentioned earlier, this new film has already grossed over $1 billion worldwide and given a hugely needed boost to movie theatres as well. So, Jason, can you first tell us why it's taken 36 years to get this sequel to be made?
Well, it's simple. This film is so great, and I don't think it would be this good if they'd made it a few years earlier. But yeah, I mean, there's been talk of a sequel for years, but Tom Cruise has kind of resisted the idea until director Joseph Kosinski finally convinced him to 2017. So yeah, they set out to make the film, and it was ready to be released, but then obviously COVID-19 had other ideas, and so here we are. I mean, it's one of a couple of films that's doing really well at the moment, and I think audiences throughout much of the world have just really enjoyed this film, and yeah, I'm really excited to talk about it. It's quite different from Decision to Leave.
Very different. Darcy, can you tell us about the plot itself?
Yes, so, I mean, the film takes place more than 3 decades after the original. Pete Maverick Mitchell is still this amazing fighter pilot, but, because of his rebellious streak, he's never really risen in terms of rank in the Navy. So he's still a captain. But then there is this threat involving uranium enrichment and a very vaguely described rogue state that needs to be dealt with. And, it's an extremely dangerous mission that people... the fighter pilots who take part are unlikely to come out of it alive. And so he's asked to train a group of young pilots and to choose who is actually going to fly the mission. Among the pilots is Rooster, who is the grown son of Goose. If you've seen the original film, there's this character, with the nickname Goose, who was very close to Maverick, and Maverick feels a great sense of guilt, surrounding this character. So there's backstory in that sense.
Sure, that connection to the original. Jason, again, it sounds like a film full of cliches.
Oh yeah, but case? It works. Bring on the cliches. But yeah, visually, it's one hell of a ride. I've seen it twice now at the Yongsan IMAX, one of the biggest IMAX screens in the world. And sadly, you rarely get these films anymore. That it's just everything is so CGI kind of heavy, and Tom Cruise is clearly an actor who wants to get in the cockpit and take things to a different level. And oh boy, does he do that! And all credit to him.
Well, when this film was perhaps first announced, I think most people would have thought that this was a terrible idea, that it's been too long since the original, that Tom Cruise is frankly too old, that Top Gun was just a film that didn't need a sequel, but it looks like he's proved everyone wrong.
I think part of the reason that the film works is because he is so old right now and he seems vulnerable. Like, in one sense, the plot's familiar, but there is kind of this undercurrent that he's reached a certain age where we recognize that this is kind of his last time around. There are other characters in the film who we're kind of saying goodbye to in the sense as well. And so there is this kind of bittersweet element beneath everything that's happening. And ultimately all the air sequences are really well done, but what impressed me was the emotional structure of the film as well. And the way that it kind of builds on the emotions, I thought was really well done. And so that's, I think, why it works extra. Yeah,
I love the Val Kilmer character in here. It's just perfectly done. He's only in it for one scene, but it just works. And there's this one line that's just classic.
Okay, so 2 great films to check out this week if you can. We'll leave it there for Movie Spotlight. Jason, Darcy, thank you once again for your time.
Yeah, pleasure to be here.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.